week-aged children from many races had raised their primary limb to gain the teacher's attention. It was rare a child of such a young age showed interest in galactic history, but when learning of the liberation of one's race by a species that had lost everything in the process, even a naive child's attention was captivated. The class's teacher was silent a moment, studying the child that had asked the question. The Kiltan still bore the genetic markers from centuries of slavery and biological conditioning, but even after just a few generations of freedom, they were fading. The humans always answered that question the same way, because someone had to. The Terran ambassador has requested to speak before the council and has been granted the floor. You may speak. The speaker, a Kiltan elder, stood at the foot of the council's dais. The creature's chitin crest was gilded in rare metals and was draped in expensive robes, but it was little more than decoration, an expensive bauble flaunted by its masters. An impressive representative of his species, purchased and modified for the unique task of standing motionless and speaking a clear, unaccented galactic common, and capable of little else, at least in the eyes of the council species. The Terran ambassador was an older man, dressed in a simple if well-tailored suit, and using an old wooden cane to counter an otherwise severe limp. The man approached the speaker's post, located near the Kiltan speaker, and stood still a moment to study the larger, albeit just as old, creature in all its finery. Thank you, Speaker. Council, I appreciate the opportunity to address the gathered signatory species. Members of the council were visibly irritated by the humans' choice to address the speaker directly, and them second. But the humans were new to the Senate and held only a minor place. Likely this would be the first and quite possibly last time a human ambassador would be given the right to address the chamber. The various Senate members and representatives murmured and laughed at the human's crude behavior, but the old human simply stood leaning on his cane and waited for silence. The room died down in short order. Everyone had better things to do, and gossiping about the humans was not one of them. When silence reigned again, the human cleared his throat and finally spoke. Humanity is a young species compared to many here, a mere 300,000 and some years from our more recent evolutionary ancestors till now. In our history are many dark truths of our past, things for which we hold no pride, but from which we have drawn strength and wisdom. He glanced at the Kiltan speaker for a moment, then looked directly at the Rashinian representative. Since joining the council and being granted a place in the Senate, albeit a minor one, our philosophers and lawmakers have pored over the laws and standards held by this ruling body. Humanity had arrived on the council's awareness a scant few years prior. Little was known of them, mostly due to apathy on the part of many of the signatory species and the council itself. They had met the minimum requirements for membership, and had levied the mandated fees, and little more was expecting of them. The private sector would sort out the fledgling race and likely drive them into crippling debt, as was so often the case with minor races. We have known slavery. Only 300 years ago was its practice finally abolished entirely among my own people. We believe the practice abhorrent. The belief that any one lineage, nation, or species is inherently subservient is folly. We learned long ago that divisions of class based on race or gender simply limits the potential of the population. There were angry murmurs throughout the chamber. The council itself grew restless with simmering rage that an upstart race and new petition to the assembly would make such bold and aggressive statements. It was once believed that women were second-class citizens, that they should stay in the home, raise the children, and cook the meals, that they could not be scientists or politicians or doctors. It was once believed that the people of Africa were subhumans, capable only of mimicking civilized customs, and were suited to little outside of hard labor. Wars were fought among my own people to bring an end to such beliefs. Laws were passed on the basic requirements and rights of every human. Constitutions were rewritten. The angry rumbling of the assembled Senate grew, but were held from a full outburst by the staying hand of the Silient's counselor, who glared with cold yellow eyes at the small, frail human below. As such, I have been directed by my leaders to put forth a motion to the council. He turned to face the council rather than the assembled Senate members. The practice of slavery is to be abolished, and all species be given free and equal standing on the Senate. The worlds of their birth and any former colonies returned to their own rule, and reparations be paid. Naturally, not something that can be achieved overnight, but we are prepared to offer economic boons and adjudication to help facilitate the transition. The ambassador's tone was straightforward and calm. No sense of sarcasm. It was as if the statement could only have one logical response from the Senate and Council: to accept the Terran terms. The outrage boiled over. A mindless roar of accusations, threats, and insults spilled forth from the Senate onto the human ambassador, who simply stood, leaning on his cane and studying the council, then turned his attention to the speaker, who simply stood staring at the old human in disbelief. He would not dare hope, of course, but he could appreciate the words of what would soon surely be another enslaved species pressed into service for the council. At a gesture from the council species, the Senate quieted. The eldest of the council races stood then, a towering creature of scaled hide and crooked-fanged jaw. The Silients have ruled the stars for thousands of your years. We have conquered a dozen empires before the council was even formed. Tell your leaders that no upstart younglings will dictate to the council. Yours shall be just another footnote in history, and your descendants shall work in chains for their betters. The ambassador smiled at the speaker, then looked up at the Silient's counselor. A young race we are, yes, but know this. 400 years ago we landed on our homeworld's moon. 20 years prior, we split the atom. 40 years before that, we discovered flight. We have known war without end for all of our 200 millennia of existence. And should you choose war, you shall quickly learn how far we have come from the first fire-hardened spear to now. 400 years ago, your grandfather sat in that chair, counselor. He came to and from his palatial estate in the same luxury shuttle you use. He rested both hands on his cane and studied the council races, a hint of amusement showing through. 400 years ago, the same patrol vessels monitored your shipping lanes, as those same ships have for 400 years before that, and likely would 400 years from now had nothing changed. You have been stagnant for thousands of years, counselors, peaked, crested, and contented. 300,000 years ago, my ancestors forged spears with branch and flame. Do you wish to learn what our spears look like today? Another sudden surge of violent outcry from the Senate, the counselors themselves driven to a rage, and the human ambassador simply looked to the speaker again. The call for war echoed through the Senate and was eagerly received by the council. But the human ambassador had known all along that there could have only been one outcome. Why? The speaker asked, and the ambassador simply smiled sadly. Because someone had to. The children were quiet, all watching their teacher, or glancing at their Kiltan classmate. They were young, and knew little of the conflict which had torn the known galaxy asunder so many years ago. They knew it only as the Liberation Wars, or the Great Rebellion. It was celebrated annually, with great gatherings and moments of silence to honor the war dead and to appreciate the liberties and freedoms gained, to lament the horrors of the past and what had been lost. The Kiltan child was silent, its secondary manipulators scratching at its carapaced underbelly with nervous energy. How? It took the council 2 of their years to assemble a fleet to deal with the humans, but the humans had been preparing even before their ambassador spoke to the Senate. I beg forgiveness, counselor, but is it wise for someone of such importance as yourself to accompany the fleet? We know little of the Terran military capabilities. The Grand Admiral of the punitive fleet stood next to the seated Silient's counselor. The fleet had finished assembling and was navigating its way across the gravity well of an unnamed dead star. 117 vessels from the various Senate species had gathered in their independent squadrons. They were only minutes from making their first jump into what was believed to be Terran-controlled space, the location of the first contact between the Terran merchant marine and a council patrol ship. They have been spacefaring for only 400 years. The Silients have ruled the stars for thousands. Whatever these humans may believe, their place among the stars shall be at our feet. The counselor's tone was dismissive and irritated. Irritated that the admiral, commanding 4 Silience battleships and their associated escorts and support vessels, it would prove more than enough to... Admiral, multiple energy spikes ahead. There are... The bridge of the admiral's command ship erupted in sudden activity as reports started to come in. Sensors are down! Through the looming windows of the command deck, the flashes of dozens of ships dropping out of FTL could be clearly seen. Hunter's Roar reports unidentified targets and weapons locks. There are unknown ships all around us. What is going on? The Grand Admiral stalked into the center of the command deck as the confusion continued. Crew worked diligently to find an answer for the Admiral, but strange reports continued to flood their terminals. Kinetic penetration starboard! Casualties reported on the soaring wind! A barrage of contact reports were streaming in from various ships of the punitive fleet. All guns target and fire at all viable targets! The Admiral barked the order as he became overwhelmed by the total lack of information he was being provided with, and even as he finished speaking, the battleship shuddered as weapons fire impacted the heavily armored hull. Hull breach! Gun decks! Casualty reports coming in! More unidentified targets. Gun decks targeting and returning fire. The counselor sat unmoving, frozen with rage. The Grand Punitive Fleet was being made fools of, and there was nothing he could do about it. Not that that mattered to him. With each shudder of the ship's hull and confused, useless report by the command stations, he found himself just a bit closer to simply striking the Grand Admiral down and ordering a withdrawal of the fleet. Sir, emergency call from the malicious. They have been boarded. They have lost control of engineering and central computer. And then suddenly, everything stopped. Admiral! System security has identified an unknown signal and blocked it. Systems are coming back online now. The Admiral turned towards the speaker. The ship's onboard computers technician rarely had anything to say during combat maneuvers. What are you talking about? There are a series of microsatellites around the fleet, Admiral. They were inert, and the computer wrote them off as simple debris. They activated when we came into range, and they began attacking our systems. The technician shrank in his chair, expecting the Admiral, or more likely the counselor, to explode with rage at the discovery. There was a moment of silence as the bridge crew struggled to clear the remaining errors and sensor ghosts from their systems. The Grand Admiral could only glare out the windows of his ship towards where the FTL flash of what must have been the human fleet had entered the system. What is the situation? The Silience counselor addressed the sensors operator, who was frantically trying to clear the errors in the ship's sensors. There are no enemy ships around us, counselor. The fleet was firing on itself. The counselor rose from his seat and approached the sensor operator's station, and the crew member only had time to realize someone had approached before the counselor had grabbed the crewman's throat from behind, clawed fingers digging into leathery hide with ease. Blood sprayed across the terminal, followed by thick strands of viscera, as the operator's throat was torn free and flicked upon the terminal. His death was slow. The Admiral and much of the bridge crew remained silent as their dying crew member thrashed on the floor in a quickly widening puddle of blood, and the counselor stalked back to his seat. But before he could sit, the communications operator suddenly spun around. The Grand Admiral stared at the display, his mind racing to understand, again, what was happening. Every ship in the fleet displayed some degree of battle damage, and his communications officer was in a heated argument with the captain of the malicious over the apparently fake report of having been boarded. The bridge door opened, and a fresh crewman darted to the sensor station, coldly dragging their dead predecessor out of the way before setting to work. Enemy ships ahead and closing fast. I'm having trouble fixing their positions, sir. They are employing active and passive stealth measures. Admiral to the fleet. I've nothing to say that the politicians haven't already. Today, we fire the first shots in a war we have been preparing for years. You know your duty and what's at stake. Do your children proud. The human admiral, a stately woman of steel-gray hair and sharp features, stood on the bridge of the Independence, the largest carrier in the Terran fleet. The ship's captain continued to see to the vessel's preparations for the coming battle. The admiral surveyed the fleet on a holographic display. 50 warships, the best humanity could produce, were arrayed in their formations, and the carrier group was deploying squadrons of strike craft. They were outnumbered more than 2 to 1. The punitive fleet had almost 3 times the tonnage of her fleet, and would employ tactics and formations that had been proven in combat for centuries. But they were fractured. Each Senate species ships operated as an independent entity, rather than an extension of the whole. The Grand Admiral would be commanding the ship on which they rode, as well as dictating orders to the rest of the fleet. Orders that would then be interpreted differently by every sub-admiral, who in turn commanded their own ship and their own fleet. They would be slow to respond to changes in the battle. The opening salvo from the human fleet came in the form more electronic warfare. The Admiral glanced to her left, to the holographic display of the ship's combat AI, modeled after the ancient goddess Athena, who was coordinating with the 5 other combat AIs of the fleet. They barraged the punitive fleet with signals and false readings, actively infiltrating their communications network and wreaking havoc on their fleet's ability to function coherently. The second salvo was kinetic. Torpedoes leapt ahead. Arcing high above or below the plane, the punitive fleet was arrayed along, before coming to a stop and going dark, waiting to pounce when Athena and her siblings gave the signal. Depleted uranium penetrators were launched at fractions of the speed of light, flashing across the void towards the enemy fleet, meant more to force the enemy out of formation than to actually strike the enemy ships. And waves of strike craft fanned out ahead of the human fleet, racing towards the reeling Council fleet, carrying payloads of high-yield nuclear warheads that would soon seed the battlespace with pulses of electromagnetic radiation, both to further scramble the enemy's sensors and to obscure the advance of the human fleet. The ensuing battle was brief and bloody. In only a few short hours, the punitive fleet was shattered, 2/3 of its numbers crippled or destroyed. But humanity had underestimated the Senate species' dedication to the Council's directives, or perhaps their fear of reprisal for failure. Where damaged human ships would withdraw, Senate vessels were just as likely to launch themselves forwards with suicidal intent, ramming human ships or dying in the effort. Over half the human fleet was lost in the battle, often with all hands. A dozen Senate ships sacrificed themselves to cover the retreat of the Grand Admiral's flagship, although by that point, the Silient's counselor had assumed personal command, after killing the Grand Admiral, of course. It was a victory for the young upstarts, but a Pyrrhic one, and set the tone for the conflict to come.
We regretted it. We deeply regretted it. This aging clunker was all we could afford, and we were warned, repeatedly, that it would have been better if it were scrapped, but we ignored it. But for a fledgling cargo company made out of last-minute desperation, it was all we could scrape together. Granted, the clunker had served us dutifully for the last 2 years and had almost universally ignored our careful nurture. So here we were trapped in a dry dock on a backwater star system. Engine and main drive refusing to start up. Computer systems and navigation trying to send us into the ass end of nowhere. Any tool we try to use either makes it worse or does nothing. Any attempt to fix any of the ship's programming simply results in any changes reverting within hours. We had given up. At this point, we were simply waiting for the harbor master to fine us and have the ship scrapped, giving us a loss on the cargo we carried as a write-off, and then soak our heads in the bar. I, along with 7 of my 8 crewmates, sat in solemn contemplation on the ship's bridge, listening to the angry beeping coming from the Navi comp screen. I looked at my fellows, outcasts, castaways, rebels, and forgotten. I was the captain. My pack had cast me out after I reached a certain age and drifted out into the cosmos, finding these guys rotting in a backwater club. Jess had lost a fight with a Tarian, missing 2 of the fingers on his left paw. Ray and Rad were brothers, having run away from home only to get caught in gang warfare. Laura and Amy were still barely out of being cubs, but every male was wary of going near them as their past was one I refused to speak of. Oliver was the ship's chef, and alongside his wife Kayla, they were the odd couple out. Oliver was one of us, a Vulpinian. Kayla was a Felonid. She was the only non-Vulpinian in the crew. Did we care? No, not even a little. She sat in her husband's lap as we waited for the harbor master to finally get tired of us and scrap our only remaining home. There was an 8th crew member, Lars. A grizzled veteran of war with a scarred right eye and a chip on his shoulder who was our security, but he was out in the dry dock trying to source some parts. Of course, it also didn't help that this was human space. Humans terrified most of the galaxy. After what happened with them and the Rakandi, nobody dared get in their way. Not even most law enforcement would try stop them. I heard a short beep go off, one that wasn't of the angry variety. Proximity alarm. I looked at one of the few screens that still worked and noticed it was Lars with a human in tow. They both approached the airlock and began equalizing pressure so they could enter. It was a human, all right. But he wore a uniform I had never seen before. I got up from my seat and helped Lars unjam the airlock doors. Again. "Good day, Cap. I'm back. I miss anything?" I grunted as I pushed the door to its open position and moved aside to allow my guest to pass through. "Not really. Aside from more angry beeping, no." The human wandered in without a word. Being 2 feet shorter than the rest of us, I barely noticed he walked in. He wore a heavy robe made of polymers and beast leathers, dyed a scarlet red. His face covered by a gas mask of sorts, a cowl over his head, and carried with him a walking stick in the shape of an enormous sharpened wrench. Underneath it, I could very clearly see some heavy biomechanical augmentation, some cables and wires where there should never be cables and wires. He looked around for some time, then up at me. He bowed his head silently and walked over to the bridge. "Is this the harbor master?" "No. Apparently he is a mechanic of sorts. I told him about our ship's problems while I was browsing the mothballed parts yard, and he offered to check it out." Lars replied as he double-checked the airlock was properly sealed. "Ah, we can't afford his consultation, you know. We're in dire straits as it is." I sighed, sorrowful, and followed him to the bridge. "What other choice do we have? What's that old human saying? Between a rock and a hard place?" "Don't remind me. If we miss this cargo delivery, we will face lawsuits and fines from the Juhanti Empire. If we go home, we'll be hanged. If we stay here, we will suffer the human bureaucracy." Both of us shuddered in fear at that last one. The human was on the bridge, silently looking around. Eerily quiet, he just stood in front of each component, occasionally extending a hand out and waving it about at whatever piece of machinery he was looking at. Once or twice, he took out a cable from the wearable computer on his left arm and plugged it into a console, then stood silent. This behavior continued for about an hour as he moved his way through the ship, finally approaching the reactor. Each time he encountered a new machine, strange things seemed to happen. Screens previously thought broken or worthless turned on displaying a strange code we had never seen before suddenly came to life near his presence. The drinks machine we were never able to get working whirred to function and dispensed a drink in a can. Displays or boards that either gave us a lot of trouble or outright refused to work, even if they had been freshly replaced, suddenly came to life. A computer bank we had previously thought was just broken junk inexplicably whirred to life for a few minutes when he walked in the room. He typed on a few consoles, then waved a hand, shutting everything down. He looked at a specific part of a mechanical device, then reached in, pinpointing exactly the location of a misaligned gear wheel, putting it back into place. That machine instantly booted up and began working again. He encountered a switch we had previously confirmed linked to nothing. Upon turning it on, the ship's backup life support system suddenly booted up. We never knew it even had a backup life support system. I personally went through this ship a dozen times over the last 2 years. That switch never did anything, and I never found a backup life support system. We were getting nervous now. He had remained mostly silent. The only noises we could hear from him were his footsteps and the breathing from his gas mask, mixed in with a rare sound. As he approached the reactor, he went into a combat stance and brandished the wrench staff he was holding in a defensive posture, pointing the sharpened end at the reactor's fuel port. He fumbled about for a few seconds, then procured some kind of small, finger-sized containment vessel that was glowing a bright, sparkly blue. He inserted this device into a port on the underside of his wrench and stood there in front of the reactor as if he was facing down a demon. "In the name of the machine spirit, I command thee to cease thine heresy and return thyself to the fold of the Iron Lord," he suddenly yelled out. He then bashed the casing of the reactor 3 times. "Cease your heresy!" Each time the wrench impacted, the ship shuddered, and a wave of electrical energy of blue and purple emitted itself from the impact point. The ship went dark for 2 minutes. Then we all heard the reactor start up again. The bridge came back to life. The life support mechanism suddenly whirred back to function. Monitors previously broken suddenly returned to full functionality, and the airlock cycled itself. A starboard thruster that had never worked suddenly sputtered to life as a spark of gas burst out of it. Then it shuddered to full power. Shielding arrays that had only ever worked under duress burst to function as the ship was now bathed in a soft blue glow. Noise of machinery and computers suddenly powering back to life or restoring to function as though there had never been any problem saturated our hearing for the next 10 minutes. Ray and Jess were besides themselves with excitement as they began to scour readouts and started learning things about the ship that they never knew existed. Within the space of a few minutes, the ship started to work as though it had just been released from its parent dry dock. The human then returned to the bridge and silently looked around for a bit more. He then looked at his wrench staff and removed the device he put in it earlier. It was now glowing a dark purple, emitting a kind of energy that frankly scared me. He carefully placed it in a sealed container and put it on his belt holster. He waved his hand and the ship returned to a standby mode meant for dry dock or station operations. He took a more proactive approach this time and started typing on consoles and checking readouts. After a while, he seemed satisfied. The machine spirit has been punished for its insolence and defiance. Its demands for appeasement have been met. However, please note of the following, he said, his voice a distorted biomechanical monstrosity as he handed me a data pad. I read them aloud to the crew. Starboard thruster needs to be replaced. Life support system backup needs a new O2 volumetric scrubber. Defensive turret requires barrel replacement and... What the... I strained to consider the concept of the last item. Melody's call requests fuzzy dice? I looked at the human in pure confusion. He seemed to understand what was going through my head. Melody's call is the ship's soul name. All ships have a birth name and a soul name. The fact she told you this is proof she trusts you. She wants fuzzy dice, the human responded. He reached behind him and retrieved a box he was carrying on his back, and rummaged around in it for a moment, and retrieved a pair of fuzzy, fabric-covered cubes attached to each other by a strong cord. He then hanged it in pride of place in the middle of the room from the ceiling. The ship seemed to respond to it, somehow. It let out a soft groan of metal, as if it were letting out a sigh of relief. Then the ship's noise dampeners kicked in, and beyond some beeping and normal noise, there was silence. "Walk always in the light of the void," he said, gave us a bow, and walked out, the airlock opening, cycling and closing with no effort. Within 2 days, we had completed the delivery with nary a problem for the entire trip and had 6 months' worth of contract work as a result of it. The reactor seemed to gain more power faster, the shields slightly stronger and more flexible. The ship, after we replaced the parts on the list we were given, could suddenly pull of maneuvers that barely a month prior would have sheared it in half. Ray and Jess ended up putting a shrine of some kind, based on the emblem seen on the human's cloak in front of the reactor. Every week on Sunday, we would all gather in front of it, and Ray would use a socket wrench he bought and gently tap the reactor housing 3 times. The ship served us well for the next 30 years before it gave us any trouble.
Little ships. The refugees below were panicking. From his balcony atop the spaceport, Oz could see that the throng of life forms in the street below was becoming dangerous. Thousands of his people were being crushed up against each other by the sheer volume of people in the crowd. There were other species, too, creatures of every shape and size, and shouts for space pierced the air in a dozen languages. Those at the back, clinging to any shred of hope for salvation, shoved forwards blindly, fear and desperation rendering them oblivious to the crush ahead. Their struggle was all for nothing. No rescue awaited them inside the spaceport. The last ship off-planet was barely more than a twinkle in the sky. A beautiful Federation cruiser, capable of carrying 10,000 life forms. It had abandoned them, taking 200 beings. It was indistinguishable from the stars now, fleeing the doomed planet and leaving the refugees below to their gruesome fate. Death awaited the lucky ones. Slavery was the best the others could hope for. The balcony shook as a nearby explosion rattled the spaceport to its foundations. Oz clung to the railing and waited for the shaking to subside. The enemy were coming closer now. the crackle of laser fire in the distance growing louder by the second, almost drowned out by the screams of the crowd below. We brought this upon ourselves, he thought. It had been exhilarating for his people to discover that they were not alone in the galaxy. There was a whole community of species out there, a federation. They had made his species such grandiose promises, telling them they would make them rich, advanced, and powerful. And so, they had opened their borders to them, grasping hungrily at the technology, information, and power they had been offered. They had drawn too much attention to themselves. Eventually, the enemy noticed them too. The transponder in his pocket flashed and beeped, ignored. He watched on in horror as the closest enemy gunship, drifting lazily above the city, rained destruction on the buildings below. An explosion rocked the side of a distant skyscraper, toppling it like a tree and blasting chunks of debris into the street. The ship was heading directly towards him, carving a path of ruin in its wake. The worst part was that they had known this was coming. They could have been saved. He had sent dozens of distress signals to every government that had a representative on his planet. Every single one had abandoned them to their fate. Cowards, all of them. Too afraid of the invaders, too worried they would draw their ire to their own borders. You must surrender at once. Do not contact us again. You endanger our people. We're sorry. Only the humans, another relatively young species, had responded positively. We will do our best. But their systems were too distant to offer any aid. Their response had just felt like another nail in the coffin, to borrow one of their idioms. Empty words, meant to give hope to a condemned planet. As he continued to watch the crowds push and sway below, Oswald was surprised to find that he did not feel despair or sadness, only overwhelming anger. Anger that the Federation, with all its promises of wealth and power, had done nothing to help them. Anger that his people had been abandoned by the other governments at the first sign of danger. Anger that he had been left to die, whilst the wealthy and powerful fled on their yachts to live another day. The gunship was closer now. There was a collective groan of terror from the street below as some of the refugees spotted the approaching ship. Row upon row of weapons peeked out from its sleek hull like oars on an ancient boat, each one firing haphazardly into the defenseless buildings. In minutes, it would be here, and Oswald would be put out of his misery. The transponder was still beeping insistently inside his pocket. Fresh anger swelled within him. It was probably another refusal to help from some corrupt government. Expecting another dismissal, he reached into his pocket to switch it off. He glanced at the message disdainfully, and his eye widened in surprise. It was Earth. Rescue fleet incoming. Prepare for evacuation. Empty words, surely. It was too little, too late. The enemy had descended on the city like insects to a carcass. What little resistance they had been able to raise had been swept aside with brutal efficiency. The building shook again, and he watched numbly as his home was destroyed, backlit by burning buildings. The ship was almost directly above him now. He watched as the guns turned to face him. Oz closed his eye. He was bitter, angry, and resentful, but he had accepted his death. And yet, for some reason, nothing happened. He opened his eye to find the weapons swiveling to face upwards, the gunship rising quickly into the sky. Where is it going? He thought. He swept his gaze further up, and what he saw, approaching from the sky, took his breath away. Above, as though the stars themselves were descending, the light of 1,000 ships filled the sky. Earth itself was too far away to help, but it had not abandoned them. His heart leapt, and he heard the crowd below cry out in jubilation. Earth really had come to rescue them. There was hope. The fleet descended through a swarm of lasers, fired relentlessly upwards by the invaders in the city. Explosions marked where ships were annihilated by the storm of artillery, but only a few were firing back. They are being slaughtered. Why are so few of them fighting back? He thought, hope beginning to dissipate once again. As they came closer, he could make out the shape of individual ships, and his question was answered. Humanity had not sent a battle fleet. Not one frigate, cruiser, or battleship had come to rescue Oz's people. The distance from Earth had simply been too great. And yet still, It looked as though every human ship in the sector had answered the call. Little ships of every shape and size. Asteroid miners, transport shuttles, freight haulers, diplomatic barges, luxury yachts, even some pirate frigates. Humanity's little ships had flocked here, selflessly putting their lives at risk to save his people. There were simply too many for the enemy to cope with, and for everyone shot down, 3 more broke through the line to land in the city, sweeping up as many refugees as they could cram into their holds. The crowd cried out in jubilation as a clunky asteroid miner and an ancient-looking transport shuttle, pockmarked by laser fire, rattled into the spaceport. Down on the street, Oz joined the queue to board the ship. He was ushered aboard by a wizened old human, refugees cramming themselves into every inch of space. And finally, they rose into the night. Through the window, the devastation was horrifying. Explosions continued to rock the city, buildings collapsing and millions slaughtered. Oz's anger deserted him, and he was left with nothing but grief, thick and suffocating. He was grateful to be alive, but he knew he would never be able to return to the planet he called home. Earth, 1 year later. As the representative for the few of his species that survived, Oz stood alongside the human president at the dais. He had spoken for his species, although in reality, no words would ever capture the debt of gratitude they owed humanity. Of the 3,243 little ships that had answered the call, 1,350 had not returned to Earth. They had sacrificed their lives and their futures to help his people. Humanity had selflessly come to their aid, and worse, had made a ferocious enemy in doing so. He watched, vision filmy with tears, as the president addressed the planet. He was mid-speech, his bearing regal and confident. And I am confident that if given the choice, and knowing the outcome, every one of those brave souls would still fly fearlessly into that storm of fire to the aid of the innocent. And yet wars are not won by evacuations. I pledge here today, in sight of God, man, and our new allies, that we will fight the tyranny of the enemy with every ounce of our strength. Humanity does not forget its friends. He glanced at Oz with fierce eyes, and at his command, 1,000,000 warships rose into the night sky. This time, humanity was sending its big ships. Perhaps, Oz thought, I will see my home again.
About 12 years ago, a man died in high orbit over Tau Ceti 5. His name was Drake McDougal, and aside from a few snapshots and vague anecdotes from his drinking buddies, that's probably all we'll ever know about him. Another colony-born man with little records and little documentation, working whatever asteroid field the Dracs deigned to allow them. Every now and then a Drac gunship would strut on through the system, Pax Draconia and all that. But that was it. One fine day, one of those gunships had a misjump, a bad one. It arrived only 90 clicks above Atmo, with all of its impellers blown out by the gravatic feedback of Tau Ceti 5's gravity well. The Dracs scraped enough power together for a good system-wide broad beam, and were already beginning the death chant when they hit Atmo. People laughed at the recording of 60 Dracs going from mysterious chanting to what the fucking for years after they forgot the name Drake McDougal. The deafening clang and split second of stunned silence afterwards never failed to entertain. Drake had performed a hasty re-entry seconds after the gunship and partially slagged his heat shield diving after it. Experts later calculated he suffered 11 Gs when he leaned on the retro to match velocities with the Dracs, long enough to engage the mag grapples on his little mining tug. Even the massively overpowered drive of a tug has its limits, and Drake's little ship hit hers about 1.5 minutes later. Pushed too far, the tug's fusion plant lost containment just as he finished slingshotting the gunship into low orbit. It was unharmed, of course. The Drac opinion of fusion power best translated as quaint, kind of how we view butter churns. It was on the local news within hours, on newsnets across human space within days. It was discussed, memorialized, marveled upon, chewed over by daytime talk show hosts. And I think somebody even bought a plaque or some shit like that. Then there was a freighter accident, and a mass shooting on Orbital 5, and of course the first Vandal attacks in the periphery. The galaxy moved on. 12 years is a long time, especially during war, So 12 years later, as the Vandals' main fleet was jumping in near Jupiter and we were strapping into the crash couches of what we enthusiastically called warships, I guarantee you not one man in the entire Defense Force could remember who Drake McDougal was. Well, the Dracs sure as hell did. Dracs do not fuck around. Dozens of 2-kilometer-long Drax supercaps jumped in barely 90K clicks away, and then we just stood around staring at our displays like the slack-jawed apes we were as we watched what a real can of galactic whoop-ass looked like. You could actually see the atmosphere of Jupiter roil occasionally when a Vandal ship happened to cross between it and the Drac fleet. There's still lightning storms on Jupiter now, something about residual heavy ions and massive static charges or something. 58 hours later, with every Vandal ship reduced to slagged debris and 9 wounded Drac ships spinning about as they vented atmosphere, they started with the broad band chanting again. And then the communique that confused the hell out of us all. Do you hold our debt fulfilled? After the 6th or 7th comms officer told them, we don't know what the hell you're talking about, as politely as possible, the Drac fleet commander got on the horn and asked to speak to a human admiral in roughly the same tone as a telemarketer telling a kid to give the phone to daddy. When the admiral didn't know either, the Drac went silent for a minute, and when he came back on his translator was using much smaller words and talking slower. Is our blood debt to Drake McDougal's clan now satisfied? The admiral said, Who? What the Drac commander said next would have caused a major diplomatic incident had he remembered to revert to the more complex translation protocols. He thought the admiral must be an idiot, a coward, or both. Eventually, the diplomats were called out, and we were asked why the human race had largely forgotten the sacrifice of Drake McDougal. Humans, we explained, sacrifice themselves all the time. We trotted out every news clip from the space-wide nets from the last 12 years. Some freighter cook that fell on a grenade during a pirate raid on Outreach. A ship engineer who locked himself into the reactor room and kept containment until the crew evacuated. Firefighter who died shielding a child from falling debris with his body during an earthquake. Stuff like that. The Dracs were utterly stunned. Their diplomats wandered out of the conference room in a daze. We'd just told them that the rarest, most selfless, and honorable of acts that incurred generations-long blood debts and moved entire fleets, was so routine for our species that they were bumped off the news by latest celebrity scandal. Everything changed for humanity after that. And it was all thanks to a single tug pilot who taught the galaxy what truly defines man. Chancellor Laji traversed an unusually lonely pathway of the normally bustling activity of the League's diplomatic headquarters. With a saddened hiss, Laji reminded himself of the reason why it was so lonely, and why it was to be demolished as soon as the occupant at the end of the hallway left the planet. The only 2 other sapients he saw were 2 lightly armed humans standing guard outside the room. The 2 humans stepped aside, granting him immediate access. Laji's membrane flashed with white and green spots. Surprise. He had come expecting to pull his rank or try to convince the guards to let him in. A moment later, he composed himself and walked inside the soon-to-be-demolished United Systems Embassy. Is it worth it, Aaron? Laji asked, his membrane turning to a soft pink to show his sadness. What is worth it, Laji? Aaron retorted as he stared at a painting depicting a star system. Laji glanced around the room. He'd visited the human embassy a few times since their integration, but he never placed it too much attention. Why would he? Every embassy had the same commodities, bearing minor tweaks such as slightly higher or lower temperatures and humidity. The size of the room could also be different if the species in question, like the hulking Brack, exceeded 3 meters of stature. But aside from that, every embassy was the same. The Vuvkut Chancellor noticed, with grim sadness, that everything but the desk and a few choice decorations, such as the painting Aaron was staring at, was missing. Please, Aaron, this will be the last time we'll see each other. At least grant me a conversation without you dancing around the initial subject, Laji said, standing at the other side of the immaculate desk. I suppose I owe you that much, Laji. Aaron smiled to himself. To answer your question, yes. Yes, it is. The sanctions, the penalties, everything your species has achieved in these long 30 years after contacting the League, now gone. All because you'd rather stand by your skewed beliefs? Laji questioned as his membrane flashed with varying degrees of pink. The sanctions mean nothing. We'll recover the money lost one way or another over time. The penalties, on the other hand, being cut off from the galactic net and pay for all abroad humans traveling through League territory to be returned to United Systems space, that was a blow that, whilst ready to take, hurt quite badly. Aaron chuckled. And you find this amusing? Laji questioned, confused. In a sense, Aaron began. Compared to standing up for our beliefs, those losses mean absolutely nothing. Though I heard that most of the other League members are having some trouble as well, Laji hissed. I didn't want to believe the report saying that smuggling groups trafficking human music and literature sprung up days after the announcement was made, he confessed. The Belsimons, however, have entered into a Standard League year-long spiritual pilgrimage across their empire. Aaron blinked, sparing a momentary glance at Laji before returning his gaze to the painting. Really? I didn't know that. Can I know why? He asked, intrigued. Apparently, they were absolutely enamored with human cuisine. Something about how you make it just clicked with their palates, Laji explained. He was then confused when he saw Aaron smiling widely. Why are you smiling, Aaron? It seems that the Belsimons share that trait with the Quawos and the Fergis. Despite not eating meat, they devour vegan dishes as if their lives depended on it, Aaron chuckled. I am going to ignore you comparing them to your friends, Laji lamented. Humanity will regret leaving the League, Aaron. Is that a threat? Aaron asked, his smile never failing. Of course not. But cut off from the galactic market and the net, I cannot begin to imagine how your economy will function effectively. Laji clicked and chirped to indicate his apparent grief. How many humans are going to starve? How many lost their jobs? I'm sure there will be protests and riots across your territory despite taking precautions, Aaron. A few here and there. No one will starve, fortunately, since now we can direct the entire harvest production of Dawn into our space. And even without Dawn, Sunset and Orichalcum already produce more than enough to feed 40 billion hungry human mouths 4 times over, Aaron explained. And before you touch mineral issues, the Koshi already covered that front. Aaron looked at Laji with a smirk. And it's not as if the League controls the entire Milky Way, right? We have more than enough systems and space to claim, since the League will never approach the systems controlled by the ones you deem to be monsters. On that aspect, you are absolutely correct, Aaron, Laji agreed. The neutral zones existed for that sole reason, after all. But what about your private corporations? Access to the most advanced fields of study and research the League has to offer. The privileges to emergency stockpile resources in case of a disaster. We'll manage. We humans have a pretty long track record of coming up with solutions to tough situations. Aaron turned back to gaze at the painting. How about war? Is the League enraged about humanity leaving its warm embrace enough to declare war? Only uncivilized, despotic, savage barbarians would resort to violence and war to solve a problem, or just to prove a point, Laji replied, his membrane flashing a mix of gray, black, and aquamarine, regret, anger, and shame. Your species may be spacefaring now, but you were young when the before was still raging, Laji went on. War is an ugly thing. Blockades, starvation, slavery, forced labor, unethical experimentation, mass murdering. The list of horrors goes on and on and on and on. Quite, Aaron agreed. That's the most beautiful thing about the League, in my opinion. Your abhorrence of war. How your founding leaders came together, sick, tired, and revolted by the conflict that the original 20 bowed to ban and outlaw war for as long as the League stood. Aaron smiled. And even if the League were to crumble, which, at least to me, seems impossible, all of the species in the League value peace and stability more than anything. So why throw us aside for the sake of those creatures you call friends, Aaron? Are we not friends, too? Laji asked, his membrane showing how honest he was in that regard. You may have been infuriating and exasperating on many occasions, but I always considered you a friend. I don't understand why humanity has decided to stand next to those unnatural creatures. The universal laws of life seem quite correct, don't they? Aaron replied, a hint of sadness tinging his voice. All sapient life is individual. All life is organic and carbon-based. All life evolves on planets ranging from arid to humid to slightly below water, freezing biospheres. All life is independent. All life rejects the consumption of other living beings, he said. Each and every single member species fit those laws entirely. Even us fill it to near completion, except that we do consume the flesh of others living beings, he chuckled. I still remember the pain that was explaining the term cattle to the rest of the League. Laji remained silent, opting to let Aaron continue with whatever he was talking about. From your perspective, it is no wonder why you would shun, find repugnant, fear, and dare I say hate our friends, Aaron said in an empty, vacant tone. When I first started to research onto why the League would turn the Koshi away, yet embrace us wholeheartedly, I thought it was due to their appearance. But after I studied the laws and what they implied, I understood. Aaron smiled somberly. They are different. On a fundamental level, they are so different, it is scary to think about just how they can be alive, how they can exist and came to be, let alone achieve sapience. He chuckled. The universe always has a curveball ready to throw at us, doesn't it? Aaron, if you understand how their existence is a mistake. Laji jumped back in fright the moment Aaron slammed a fist on the desk, his teeth bared ferociously. They are not a mistake, Aaron said loudly, somehow managing to refrain himself from shouting, but his anger could easily be seen reflected on his face. They may be different, but as we got to know them better, we found what amazing, wonderful people they are, and we learned, despite our differences, there was no need to fear them. Our differences made us stronger. It made us us. It took a few seconds of ragged breathing before Aaron continued. And we understood. We understood we were right in our belief. All life is sacred. Aaron walked towards the painting, his eyes reflecting the deepest regret Laji had ever seen in any sapient to date. We learned that lesson in the worst possible way, Laji, Aaron whispered, stopping scant feet away from the painting. Once I'm gone, by order of the Council of Nations, a data package will be delivered to the Chamber of Chancellors. It'll contain the single piece of history we kept a secret from the League all these years. He turned his head to Laji. Do you know what system is this? Laji walked next to Aaron, all fear forgotten in the presence of the sorrow reflected in his eyes. Laji inspected the painting and found, to his surprise now that he saw it up close, that it was not only beautiful but also astonishingly profound. Was this hand-drawn? Finding his voice again, he asked. Aaron nodded. This system, I don't recognize it. What do you call it? Alpha Centauri, a trinary star system. Aaron's lips were graced with a small smile. It was also the first system in which humanity set foot on after Sol. He lost his smile. We arrived here at an M-class star we call Proxima Centauri. The first expeditionary task force was comprised of a fully multi-purposed Oberon-class exploration heavy destroyer and an escort of 5 frigates and 2 corvettes. It was all just to put a big show for the people back on Earth and the colonies in Sol, of course, but also just in case something went wrong. How is this relevant to the data package? Laji asked. Sure, first FTL test drives and explorations could be ugly, and accidents were, while not common, certainly not a rarity either. Was the entire task force lost, as did they try to splinter away from your government at the time? Neither. You see, while Proxima Centauri was uninhabited and we settled down a base of operations on Proxima Centauri B, later renamed as Lanus for the duration of the mission. You see, humanity had suspected Lanus was barely habitable, and it was. Still, it was a monumental achievement for humanity. The first-generation FTL hyperdrive worked as intended. A trip of decades was shortened to a mere 2 weeks. It meant we were no longer bound to our solar system. Then what went wrong? Laji asked, unable to comprehend why the painting invoked such an emotional response from the human he considered a friend. So far, this sounds like a successful first FTL jump. Because it was. Everything was going according to plan, Aaron said. But something unexpected happened. According to the reports, 49 days into the mission, they noticed something strange happening in the Alpha Centauri beta system. Now that humanity was so close for the first time, they noticed a moon orbiting Alpha Centauri Beta 3, a Jupiter-like gas giant. They also noticed it was not only habitable, but inhabited by a species called Sulcici. Aaron closed his eyes. Turns out our civilizations achieved spaceflight around the same time. The main difference being that we achieved FTL while they had yet to do so. Sulcishi? I don't recall ever hearing about them before, Laji said, confused, intrigued, and curious at the same time. The leader of the mission, Commander Nico Vargas, decided to attempt the first contact event in human history. But before that, they spied on all the Sulcishi broadcasting signals they could pick up. They picked apart their language, broadcasting methods, whatever they could learn from their culture and history. Essentially everything they could learn about them, they studied. Aaron opened his eyes, a hand placed on the glass protecting the valuable painting. One of the frigates returned to Earth to give the good news, and the permission was handed out immediately. When first contact was established 2 months later, clumsy as it was, it all seemed to go as planned. Despite their best efforts at the time, only small pieces and snippets of their language had been deciphered, enough to allow a basic level of communication. Then, the cultural and information exchange happened. Almost as soon as the Sulcishi learned the existence of Earth, they turned on Commander Nico Vargas and his crew. They slaughtered everyone in boarding actions launched on the other ships. They took out every ship except for a single corvette, the Augustus, that managed to beat their boarding party and run back to Earth. La'aji remained silent, his eyes refusing to blink lest he'd miss one of his facial expressions. Before humanity formed the United Systems, Laji, we were working under what we called the Federated Nations, a much-needed improvement over the lessons learned from the failed United Nations it replaced. Soon after the Augustus arrived back on Sol, we also received notice that the base of operations on Lannis had been overrun. The message detailed that if nothing was done, it was estimated that the Sulcishi would manage to reverse engineer or even duplicate our hyperdrives and outfit their, by the time, monstrous fleet in just 4 years. In terms of firepower, we were superior, but their ships outnumbered ours by nearly 20 to 1. So, a decision was made. Aaron turned to face Laji. Faced with the imminent invasion by a hostile race, the trigger was pulled. In under 6 months, every available warship was equipped with the best armament there was. They made the jump to Alpha Centauri in unison. Whilst numbering a measly 40 ships, our weaponry was superior. And this time, we weren't going to invite them or give them a chance to get close. Aaron stopped for a moment, gulping a few times as he gathered the courage to continue. We didn't take a single casualty, but we destroyed every ship they had, starting with our captured vessels. We destroyed their in-system bases and stations. We destroyed most of their satellites, and when we sent them the message to surrender, they refused. Death before starvation, was their reply. Aaron stopped again, his eyes moistening. We were fools, Laji. We were fueled by fear and bloodlust for revenge. We were ignorant. Rather than lose millions of lives in an invasion, we bombarded their homeworld with nuclear fire. You... What? Laji asked, all color leaving his membrane to now be translucid. We exterminated an entire species, Laji. They declared war to us after we stretched our hands in friendship and trust. We were betrayed. We were irrational. By the time we discovered why they did what they did, it was far too late to do anything about it. Aaron turned to the painting again. In the data package the Council is going to receive, there is a special recording. I've heard it countless times. So have every important official after the United Systems were formed. From the representatives of the Council of Nations, to their rulers, to generals, admirals, commanders, captains, diplomats, Aaron explained. It contains the cries, wailing, screams, and hatred-filled words and curses of those that found the truth. Some even committed suicide on the spot. La'aji had no words to say. To think that Aaron, a friend, colleague, and up to a few day cycles ago was a fellow chancellor, belonged to a species that had exterminated another species so coldly and casually. It made him sick to his stomachs. Even so, he desired to hear the rest of his people's dark history. They were dying and starving. Their homeworld, Friel, couldn't sustain them anymore. It had gone through a series of climate changes for the past 200 years. The reason they even achieved spaceflight was born out of desperation to save their people. When they learned about Earth, it was like a miracle had just arrived in their hands. They didn't take any chances and attacked. So great was their desperation, Laji. Aaron gritted his teeth and clenched his fists until his nails dug into his skin and crimson blood fell to the floor. And we didn't do anything to help them, to understand them. And now, the Sulcishis are no more, thanks to us. The ex-chancellor smiled. You don't have to say anything, Laji. I understand. Who knows? Maybe this is for the best. Wait, Laji spoke, surprising Aaron. Why didn't you kill the Fergis? They invaded your homeworld, did they not? It happened 50 years after we exterminated the Sulcishi. A lot had changed since then, including the formation of the United Systems and meeting the Koshi. In fact, it was our meeting them that finally cemented our belief to value all life, and that all life is sacred. As for the Fergis, we prepared to defend our home planet. Their ships slipped through our scanners until they were orbiting Earth. We were not going to fire first, but we were ready to fight if necessary, he chuckled. Thankfully, I was the recruit at the time in charge of the FTL broadcasting system. I sent a message to the Koshi asking for aid. They arrived within a few days before the Fergis settled down completely. And the rest, as they say, is history, Aaron explained. Suddenly, a series of knocks were heard coming from the doors. Ambassador Aaron, it is time, one of the guards outside called loudly. It seems it's time for me to go, he said in a relaxed tone. Nodding to Laji, Aaron walked over to the doors. If you want the painting, you can have it, Laji. Consider it a gift. Have you told them? Laji asked as he watched Aaron open one of the doors. They know, all of them, and they accepted us regardless of our mistake, Aaron replied. Do you believe the League would have accepted us had they known the truth? Aaron let out a mirthless chuckle. Peace be with you, your kind, your friends, and the League, Laji. Laji didn't hear the door close. He didn't have to hear it to know Aaron and his guards were leaving. His eyes slowly turned to the painting. Suddenly, he understood the meaning behind it. No, he whispered in the empty room. Level with me. The orb clicked in response. I maintain my present orientation, Commander. No, the commander started, then stopped. His expression softened with something approaching sympathy. He spoke again, saying, I mean, tell me the situation as it is. Don't sugarcoat. He caught himself this time. Don't leave anything out. The orb blinked and nodded, shaking its eye case up and down. Our position at Veen is unstable. The aggressors have taken the outer system and demand that the inner system be surrendered. They are gathering fleet assets. We cannot withstand them even now, but they do not attack. It was the commander's turn to nod. What about us? The combined task force, the orb said. If it moves to support Veen at best speed, we'll reach the system within 15 hours. There is no closer force. It is our prediction that the aggressors will proceed to invade the inner system before we reach Veen. The commander mulled this over for a moment and sat back against his desk. But we'll be able to save the system if we move now? The orb shook its eye case the other way. No. The combined task force will be insufficient. The aggressors will take the inner system regardless of resistance. For a time, the room was silent. The commander closed his eyes and let his head hang down, thinking about what it would mean to commit the task force to action, and about what would happen if he chose to stand off. We have a pact with you, he said, still leaning against the desk, head still down. We make for Veen. Tell your people to expect us. The orb nodded once more and departed. The commander began to see faces. These he would never see again, for Veen would claim them. He opened his eyes and opened a fleet-wide channel to announce a course change. 12 hours later, the command staff stood in a circle around the holoset aboard the bridge of the flagship, watching the sensor data pour in. The task force had pushed all engines beyond safety limits, damaging them irreparably, but cutting travel time by more than an hour. The lead vessels were now close enough to Veen to access the system's sensor network, and the information they were collecting was now being shared throughout the fleet. The situation was entirely hopeless. The aggressors had begun their attack 7 hours ago, and were now encroaching upon the second planet, the final fortress of Vane. Friendly forces had been decimated and were now making their last stand around that world, fighting to their last breath against a dozen fleets, each more than 20 times their own tonnage. The orb, now hovering over the holoset, reported that its people were ready for the arrival of the combined task force. A clock within the holoset had begun counting down, and reversion to real space was expected in 6 minutes. It took 2 minutes for the command staff to finalize their defense plans. The commander made his final address before reversion 3 minutes later. The enemy is present in overwhelming numbers, which will just make the losses we are about to inflict all the more embarrassing. We will bleed them so badly they will execute their officers for incompetence. We're all the cavalry there is, so make the charge count. Don't hold anything back. All craft, prepare for combat. All 68 ships of the combined task force reverted at the same time, punching a hole in space so wide that for a brief moment it blotted out the sun. In that moment, every ship fired everything. The light of their main guns burned through a squadron of capital ships, caught with their shields facing the wrong way. Before the nearest aggressor fleet could reorient itself, the combined task force had brought down twice its mass in enemy metal. The element of surprise was quickly spent. The aggressors turned their ships to face this new threat, shifting a full 3 fleets out of position to match a force lesser than theirs by far. The defenders of Veen took this opportunity to renew their attack, and the sky above the Second World brightened once again with the lights of battle. The flagship shuddered as it lost its portside missile pod. All around it, the warships of the combined task force were breaking apart, their well-built hulls no match for the immense volume of fire raining down upon them. The commander stood and saluted them, closing his eyes one last time as his own ship was smashed to ruin. Behind him, the orb-shaped emissary backed itself into an alcove and anchored itself there, just as the shields failed completely. Veen's defenders were extinguished 37 minutes later. All that remained of the combined task force were expanding clouds of gas and wreckage, reduced to small pieces by the aggressors to ensure no survivors. But the emissary, anchored to the alcove, was still there, though the structure it was attached to had long since ceased to be a part of the bridge. When Veen was retaken over 100 days later, the emissary was recovered, its beacon still broadcasting weekly. Its memory was made part of public record. Parts of it were played at the signing of the treaty with humanity, formally bringing the two empires together in unity. The ambassador told those gathered the full story of the Battle of Veen. In 200 seconds, a meager 68 ships destroyed or crippled 4 times their number of enemy vessels, including 3 battlecruisers and a command carrier, each of those far outmassing the human flagship. The combined task force perished in its entirety, but it left 3 fleets in disarray, and by drawing these away from the defenders, magnified their effectiveness against the remaining ships. As was their custom, the aggressors left the corpses of their dishonored dead floating around one of their gutted ships. Among them were hundreds of high-ranking officers, including an admiral, executed for incompetence. Veen maintains its own special fleet unit, numbering 68 ships. The flagship, at the request of the emissary, was christened Level With Me. That nightmare sound. Celeste was surprised to see a ship pop up on their screens. Their intel had said that this sector had no enemy ships and was largely ignored by all parties in the conflict. That is until Eshar High Command decided that an ignored sector was the perfect place for an exploratory military expedition. Celeste wasn't sure who had that brilliant idea. The system was boring. There was a reason no one paid any attention to it. No raw materials that weren't in abundance elsewhere, no strategic value, no sapient life forms, only one planet with a bit of algae goo. Still, Eshar had sent 3 cruisers to explore the system and assess whether they should build a base here. Maybe a secret research base? A few hours after their jump, that ship popped up on their screens. From the readout, it was clear that the ship had seen them and was headed their way at top speed. "What kind of ship are we looking at, Lieutenant?" Celeste asked their sensor tech. After studying the readouts for a moment, Lieutenant Sarwin replied, "Human, putting out quite a heat signature for its size, as it's smaller than any of our ships." "Ha! That heat signature is probably because those backwards apes are still using 50-year-old designs." Celeste clicked their mandibles, laughing. The rest of the bridge crew joined in. Humans had only been on the intergalactic scene for a few generations, but they had never lost their unofficial status as something of a joke. Which of our ships is best positioned to intercept? Celeste asked their navigator. After a quick readout of the telemetries, the navigator reported that their own ship was best suited to intercept. All right, move us into position. Ready the long lance? The human ship continued its direct approach at high speed. As it got closer, the sensor tech was able to discern more of the ship. It's quite small. Their shields are at full power, and it appears they have slapped various weapons pods onto the outer hull. Their tech ended incredulously. Everyone on the bridge laughed again. Ship in range within 3 minutes! Celeste waited impatiently. The humans had to see that they were outgunned by merely one of their ships, let alone 3. In spite of their dumpy old rust bucket of a ship, Celeste was a little bit nervous, as they always were before an engagement. Anything could happen, especially the unexpected. Plans never worked flawlessly. Inform the other 2 cruisers to take up supporting positions, Celeste told their communications officer. The officer raised their eyelid in surprise, yet did as they were told. 2 flashes, brighter than any sun, lit up the view screen. The cruiser shook from one side to the next. Red lights flashed in alarm. Everything turned from one moment to the next to chaos. Fire! What happened? Report! Celeste shouted in a panic. The human ship appears to have fired 2 long-range energy weapons, the sensor tech shouted. Our main cannons have been knocked offline, but our secondary array is engaging! At that moment, a sound started and grew louder and louder until it became a shriek. More red lights flashed. Explosions from the hull crowded the view screen. Electric arrays in the bridge blew. Celeste's second-in-command punched the button for the escape pod on the captain's chair. As Celeste was wrapped into the escape cocoon, the tumult of the bridge receded. But that horrible, dreadful noise that Celeste had heard was still there, in the background. They knew it would haunt their nightmares.
Crack. Keep your guard up, Master Opal.